this is something I tell my smart friends a lot. Like IQ is largely genetic. And so if you have a high IQ, your kid is likely to have, I don't know, apparently it's like the average of you and your spouse, right? And if IQ is largely genetic, then smart people should have kids because they are more likely to produce the next Elon Musk or whoever you want to sub into that. It, like your kid could potentially solve climate change and have a net good impact on the world, which I think is kind of sad because I know a lot of friends of mine who are super smart, like doctors, lawyers, and they have this kind of environmental agenda and they don't want to have kids because of that. So we're kind of entering into an idiocracy, I feel like.
I was about to mention idiocracy. I mean, that's the premise, right? But it's a true premise is that the more, I mean, if we conflate IQ with education, which is not exactly the same, but the higher education, the less likely you are to have kids, or I should say the smaller your family size ends up being on average, right? And then people with high school educations generally have more kids than people with PhDs, right? And so, I mean, that is definitely happening. I think that when we start talking about this, though, the problem is it ends up being kind of a eugenic argument at the end of the day. Not that I'm necessarily that individual thing is a bad thing, but I don't think we could ever implement kind of policies that ever kind of incentivize that. Like, how do we? I don't think we can have a policy that would, in any way, that would incentivize smarter people to have more kids. But I understand your point, though, is that if we keep on going the way we're going, which we provide a safety net to people, so you don't really have to worry about necessarily taking care of your kids to full capacity, then you get as many kids as you want. Meanwhile, people who are more intelligent, again, that word is kind of controversial in itself, is what does it actually mean, but if we're talking about educated, that yeah, they're number one, they're afraid of, like you said, of like over expanding and hurting the planet, but also a lot of them are career driven. It's like, oh, I put off kids, especially women, I'll put off kids until I'm 35. Well, if you put off kids till you're 35, then you can't have 5 kids. I mean,
Yeah.
you could, but you really can't. But if you start having kids at 20, it's really easy to have 5 kids, right? And so there's a lot of different factors built up to it. I think one of the things that is hurting people the most is hurting society the most is telling young women that their careers are the almost important thing. For men, it ends up being that way in practical terms, and it has always been the way forever. But there's a new shift to telling women that's what's going to make you happy, and that's what's going to fulfill you. And I always hear the counter argument. It's like, oh no, you can go and be a stay-at-home mother if you want to, but stay-at-home mothers are ostracized in our society, and we look down at them, and they're never promoted as a good thing. And it's not a binary. You could be obviously a middle ground. You can have a career and have children, but we're promoting this kind of like Sheryl Sandberg idea that you could be a CEO and have children. Not really. You can give birth to children. But I know a lot of women in the professional world, doctors and lawyers, things like that, who have kids and then they outsource the job of parenting, right? They go to work when their kid's a couple months old and then their kid goes to daycare from 9 to 5. Well, in that case, I mean, I know this is offensive to say, but you're not really being the sort of mother that you could be if half the day your kid is with in daycare. And so we're kind of we're trying to tell women to ship their kids to outsource mothering so they can focus on their career, which I think is one of the biggest problems in society.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I guess even in just a less offensive way, it's like you could just present the question. Do you think that it's a good idea to put your 18-month-old kid in daycare? Like, at what point do they get, I mean, there are some studies and stuff. I mean, there's studies pointing in every direction, but there's studies that show that they get like separation anxiety and stuff because an 18-month-old kid is still a baby. Like they can barely talk. And so putting them in a place full of strangers, and by the way, it's not like, apparently sending them to grandma's house is fine or like mostly fine because they know their grandparents. It's a stable figure. And then usually it's like one adult for like maybe 1 to 3 kids, right? It's not like one adult for like 10 kids, and then the adults vary and they don't really know you all that well. And I mean, there's so much difference there. And I mean, I just think like you have to ask yourself, would this really be the same as being raised by family? And I think the answer is probably no. It's pretty simple.
I think that you're right that research points a lot in different directions, but one baseline that I've seen is that when daycare, and by the way, you said 18 months, I know professional mothers that have their kids in daycare 6 months, it's way earlier than that when it's still a baby. But that's besides the point. When you look at the studies for this, it seems like it's the case that daycare is not necessarily a negative for rich people because they send their kids to daycare when the amount of adults per child, the ratio isn't that crazy. But average Americans, they send their kids to daycare and there's 15 kids for every one adult, and they're not getting individualized attention. The family part is definitely part of it. But then you said like, oh, it's one-on-one. Yeah, the individualized attention is a different thing because as a baby, you need the nurturing and you need some sort of stimulation. You can't just be lying there, right? All the time, and 9 to 5. And so maybe for rich people, it's not that much of a negative. I still think it's a negative, but and then for everyone else, it's a different story, which is kind of like like one of the troubles of our society is that rich people impose policies that can kind of work for them, but not for the rest of the rest of us and mothers, right? And so I definitely think that like we do need to reevaluate like what should be the goals when it comes to children, because a lot of mothers don't view it that way, of viewing it like it is outsourcing motherhood. I never really hear that said, but that's what it is doing. And you know what, like it would be great if you even have, like you said, intergenerational families. I'm all about that. That if you go and you kind of go to work and then the grandma takes care, perfectly fine. I mean, maybe not exactly the same, but good enough.